Hi, this is Steve Hassan, and this is my Rabbi, Moshe Waldoks of Temple Beth Zion. Thanks for taking this time to come and visit and be willing to share some of your story with us.
Nice of you to have me here. Nice to have you.
And I met you in 1998. And I won't get into my story right now, but you were pivotal to my return to Judaism. And I've been learning Torah from you and coming to shul, and it's been such a positive experience for me that I want to publicly acknowledge you and thank you for that. And you married Misha and myself, and just a life cycle things. Moshe, tell us about your story and how you came to be where you are now. Where did you grow up? And
Thanks for the opportunity. First of all, Steve, when we first met, I was just starting something new, trying to take an old congregation and bring it back to life, and we were very successful, I think, in finding a lot of people like yourself who were seekers, but looking for a way of expressing their Jewishness in a way that was truly, I would say, authentic to themselves, rather than necessarily something that they had received from someone else.
Or dogmatic.
Or doctrinal. I make it very big, one of our, I'll start from now and come back again, because I think one of the real issues with people when they hear the word religion in general, and you know this, of course, we all work, is that they expect it to be somewhat doctrinal. By doctrinal, those who don't know the word doctrinal usually means something that has been established by some sort of authoritative body within a group, which becomes the doctrine, which if you adhere to this doctrine, you are in, and if you do not adhere, you're out. When there's jurisdiction over you, that you can actually be, how should I say, punished by not adhering to the doctrine. Right. And if you are not in jurisdiction, then obviously there's nothing they can do. However, the basic idea of having anything doctrinal that is that it basically, I believe, exhibits in the modern period. In the pre-modern period is something else, but in the modern period, for me, it indicates the need to be doctrinal is a sense of deep insecurity. So that's really essential kind of thing, because ultimately, in the modern marketplace of ideas, if your ideas are not up to scrutiny, it's so transparent today, there's very little you can do to hide it. I mean, there was a time you can keep people prisoners, you can keep people.
Well, that's my work.
Exactly, as you know,
right.
and make sure they do not get.
Black and white, us versus them,
and no
versus
transparency,
evil,
right.
And the dependency on an external authority figure.
And no way to look through it, because there's no transparency.
Not to mention God is a Zeus, a humanoid that we have.
That projected sense of father, or whatever we want to call it. Now, once you break away from a doctrinal way of thinking, it can be aggravating, because we mean everybody doesn't agree with me. It's terrible. On the other hand, you do create a much greater vibrancy of experience. And I think what helped the congregation go from being a moribund old conservative shul, which
had 40 people,
whatever reason it had, basically had not been able to change. What made it work was precisely because we said this is not a place that has any particular axe to grind. Matter of fact, we'll become label-less, which already was a big thing. You're not something Judaism. I said, no, we're just Jewish. And that really opened up the doors for a lot of people.
Jews.
Or happy Jews, or enthusiastic Jews. I think that was the word they used. There were two kinds of Jews. Jews who are enthusiastic, Jews who are not enthusiastic. And I find enthusiastic people across every spectrum of politics or religion. You find enthusiastic people, you find people who are dour.
Well, and you're reminding me that one of the things that led me to meeting you was going to see the Dalai Lama in the Jew in
in 1990
book and movie. I was like, wow, you went to see the Dalai Lama, and the Dalai Lama wants to understand how the Jews survived in exile. True.
But that's a story in and of itself, because I think it really is another example of just what how I've seen my work in my life. So I would say, if let's just say, working backwards, part of what happened, and it's a very long story of how I got to this particular place in 1998, but the challenge of 1998 was can we reach out to people who are looking for a way to be Jewish within a quote-unquote synagogue structure that was not the synagogue that of their youth, which perhaps had, for some people had good experiences. I'm not saying we had bad experiences, but for most people were either neutral or basically not that.
Like many, were conservative,
Right.
bar mitzvah, and then never did anything
Exactly,
again.
right. Never really captured them in
I played basketball from my
right.
shul.
But you, because you could, because you were taller than I was. I couldn't do that. So, so that, how do you arrive at that kind of place? Well, you arrive at that kind of place, I think, for many, many different ways. One of the ways I think, which is kind of interesting, and this is really something that part of I was getting one of the subtle messages, perhaps, for why should people be all attached to their communities of origin? Why should people at all, in a world that's so filled with conflict, why should there be differences at all? Why shouldn't we all be the same? The basic totalitarianism of the left. And if there was no differences, we wouldn't fight and that kind of stuff. First of all, you don't know my family, but whatever. But people would find a reason to fight even if everybody was wearing the same shirt at the same time. But the bottom line is that we, if we really want to have an effect on the larger picture of what's going on in the world, I think you have to be grounded in something.
And I couldn't agree more. As a therapist, it's so important to have values and community.
Something that says, this is who I am, this is what I'm connected to. And then, you know what? My impact is an impact that's going to have, it's really going to make a much bigger impact, because ultimately, I've yet to meet anybody who really cares about defining his or herself as generic.
Right.
I've never met a generic artist.
Well, and for me, coming out of the Moonies in '76, I was so confused. Who was I? What do I believe? And I thought I was a Christian for a while, and I started studying the history of religion. And the more I started asking questions, the more I realized I'm comfortable with the Jewish values, core, learning, community, connection.
Right.
Helping others,
and those things came together with the positive things you did have from your own childhood. I mean, so they reinforce the fact. Oh, there can be good values. I don't have to reject in order to. That's the problem. People think you have to reject everything.
Yeah, and love over obedience and questioning.
Right.
I love that you would. When you would teach, you would say, some rabbis understand this parsha this way, and others understand it this way. What do you think?
Right, and this is the only way I think. But I think this kind of said, until the modern period. I think that the basic idea was that we studied the Torah because it was an obligation to study it, and in many ways we were somewhat freer a little bit in the pre-modern period, because we had something that united us as a community, and that was practice. So when you have common practice, when there was less of an argument about whether one should observe the Sabbath or not observe the Sabbath, there was a lot more room for ideological broadness.
Interior freedoms.
You know what I mean? Because you said, is it really that important? I mean, I'm not saying people didn't argue about whether Aristotelian understanding of God was different than the mystical. That's sure, but I mean, in our tradition, we rarely had, if ever, mass riots over ideology. I mean, physical riots over ideology. I can't imagine even one time we've had that.
Right.
We had individual fights and stuff like that. But the idea would be that because of the fact that we no longer have a commonality of practice as Jews, ideology became very important, and what you believe became very important. And I think what postmodernism began to give us, and Jewish renewal in a sense, the renewal of Judaism, which is a much, I hate to give it that we're something, a new denomination. We're not. But what the renewal of Judaism says was, let's renew those parts of ourselves that really were powerful. Let's renew those parts of ourselves that really had this primal sense of connection that we have with the divine, with the earth, with each other. And how do we renew that without getting caught up in all of the denominational stuff? That was really the real Reb Zalman Schacht's real thinking. How do we preserve the great stuff? How do we get rid of some of the nonsense? And let's not start a new branch of Judaism, but let's get everybody to clean house.
Clean house.
That's the way he saw it. So if we could give you the right kind of broom that will allow you to sweep through your own tradition and get rid of the stuff that really needed to be gotten rid of, without getting rid of the house.
So allowing women's rights.
Right, we're not getting rid of the house. It's like some people
gay
say
rights and
whatever. Some people say the best way to clean up your house is blow it up. It's true. I look at my house one day. That's the only way it's going to work. I just got to put a match to it. But put a match to it is a very extreme.
Yeah.
On the other hand, you want to eventually organize your house. You want to go through your house. You say, "Gee, this isn't useful anymore." But he was never, and Reb Zalman, I think, what was very important about him, he was never saying, like some of the older Reform, not contemporary Reform Jews, said, "Oh, that's archaic. That's superstitious, old, silly stuff. And if you're modern and sleek and this and that, you don't have any of that." He said, "No, there's really great beauty there, but it's been clouded over by years of dross. So why don't you get back to the primal power of it?" So even though it sounds like, quote unquote, it's not rational in your terms of what rationality is, but nothing in religion is really rational. It appeals to a part of ourselves that is beyond the rational. Well, I'm not saying irrational, but beyond the rational. Things that I really can't always explain. And that's really what life is about. It's not the stuff you could explain, which is nice, and I love
science.
I love Mr. Nye the Science Guy as much as anybody else, and
Right.
but even honest scientists tell me, to tell you the truth, every time I get into something, I realize how much I don't really understand.
That's the best. The people I trust the most.
I say, wow, every discovery shows me that there's a lot to be discovered.
Right.
So
you grew up Orthodox?
in I would say traditional home. My parents were not Orthodox. Let's just
They
work
were
on the words.
Holocaust
They were Holocaust survivors. They came into this country in 1949. My father had been from an area that was part of Poland between the wars, and then it's now the Ukraine. My mother was from Poland itself, and they both had lost most of their families, I would say. In my dad's case, I would say close to 98 to 99%.
Wow.
His family lived in that area that the Germans invaded after they broke the pact with Stalin back in 1941. And that's where the mobile killing units went through. It's a very difficult period. So they came, they were traditional, they weren't Orthodox. But however, I think there was on my mother's side particularly a little bit of a desire not to lose the connection. My father was much more angry with, theologically with God, etc. My mother was less so.
The trauma of loss.
Yes, trauma of loss.
What kind of God would allow
exactly,
this to
and yet, what was interesting about the Holocaust, which is a whole different discussion, is I know people who went in secular and came out very spiritual. So
yeah,
you can't. It's a transforming experience anyway. So whatever it is, my mother particularly insisted that I get a more traditional education. I remember her sister who had survived laughed at her and said, "Oh, don't do that." She said he might become a rabbi.
And look.
Yes, I'm saying. So she was right. She was warning her because that was not seen. Not only by traditional, but by many Jews as a sign of success if you suddenly became a rabbi. A hedge fund manager, no, that's something else. Even a lawyer, a doctor, right? But the rabbi was not the top of the list. But I didn't become a rabbi right away anyway. But so what I got from that was being put into an Eastern European style Yiddish-speaking yeshiva, where it was really primarily created for children of survivors because there's so many at
big beards.
Well, they were of a
black
different.
hats.
Well, to tell you the truth, the big beard black hat thing again. It's such a complicated thing. The school that these students who started my school came from, a school called Yeshivas Chaim Berlin. The Chaim Berlin was sort of a border between Hasidism and the what we call the Metnagdim, the Lithuanian yeshivot. Now the Lithuanian yeshivot, the ones from Lithuania, which were very Orthodox yeshivot, they did not have beards before the war or the long coats, and they didn't have the rabbi figure.
Not as rabbi as guru.
As guru, but that's changed. That when they came to Israel, that changed. But right now, that wasn't there. It was a very, how should I say, it was very observance oriented, but very intellectual. That's study, study, and there was even at some time a smattering of problematic to gaze into stuff like a math book or a science book, because they didn't see math or science necessarily as being problematic for Judaism as theology or stuff like that, because science can be understood as discovering the way God works in the world. So they were sort of, I wouldn't say they were modern, they were quasi-modern, but the point is that they didn't have as much of this need to be as cultish, if I can use that term.
Insular.
And cultish, it was much less cultish. The Hasidic community at that time, in the 1950s, 60s, were just trying to get itself together. They had lost so much in the war.
Right.
There was much less of an imperious feeling that we are triumphal.
We survived.
But they were just glad that they'd survived.
Right.
And they didn't know where they would be vis-a-vis the future. There was very little work at proselytization of Jews in those days. Lubavitch was the only ones that were different. And Chabad or Lubavitch were different because from the very beginning they really saw being in the United States particularly as an opportunity. They very cleverly saw that there was
go out and
fertile ground here.
Recruit.
Fertile ground here.
But they weren't recruiting Gentiles. They were just trying to find...
Jews. And as a matter of fact, the first two emissaries of what has now become a worldwide phenomenon of the Chabad house and the Chabad rabbis were Rabbi Zalman Schachter and Shlomo Carlebach. They were the first two that actually were official Chabad emissaries, and both of them left in order because Chabad couldn't hold them. In a way, they all became a little too open-minded and didn't like to report back to the central office as much as others would. So,
but this was way before
1951.
Schneerson was being considered the Moshe.
This is when Schneerson, the one who had died in '94, had just become the rabbi after his father-in-law. So they were students of his father-in-law. They were colleagues. Teacher colleagues of them. So, for instance, Reb Zalman remembers the Rabbi Menachem Mendel, who died in '94, as being his teacher when he was in a little group. He became Lubavitch only because it was a way when he came out of escape from Europe, the Chabad had set up some places where refugee kids could be, right? Because he was raised in what was called the Galician Hasidic tradition, which was not white Russian. Russian, which is
so
it's a very
we could talk
forever,
for weeks, but one of the things that so impresses me with you continually is your knowledge, your memory. You love to read, you love to study, you love to learn, and
that helps a lot if you're in my line of life.
But it's, I mean, when you wrote the big book of Jewish humor, and I love that you would tell jokes. So as we were learning Torah, I was like, oh my God, he's telling jokes while we're studying the Holy Scripture, and you're like, we gotta be human, and we gotta.
I think this we're not gonna be able to do everything at this session, but one thing I perhaps ties in with everything that we're talking about, and I think that you have really just made a good point of. In Psalm 100, we have a phrase called "Ivdu et Hashem b'simcha," serve God with joy. And come before Him with song. So I think if you really want to cut to the chase, a good test of whether or not a tradition is really having an effect is whether it can be a vehicle for joy. That's really not a vehicle for a vehicle for joy. Not joy isn't something is a state you can be in constantly. Obviously, otherwise some people would love to be. I'd love to be, but the fact is that if the goal of the service is to be a joyous person and a joyous human being and to live in a sense of joy, you have created a vehicle for opening up the heart, which will hopefully not allow you to become imprisoned. Because when we read about these remarkable people like Nelson Mandela and Natan Sharansky, and how here one's in the Gulag and one's in and they're never become prisoners. You say, how is that possible? He said, because they decided in their hearts they're free, and no matter what the physicality was, they remain free. And I think that's what, I know you're very interested in the concept of freedom and freedom of mind. I believe having a joyful mind, the capacity to laugh, to make fun of oneself, for instance, very important piece of it. If you can't make fun of yourself, then you basically are susceptible
It's so true.
Prison, you know.
All the mind control cults, they have no sense of humor.
Few fanatics have a sense of humor.
It's true. It's fear and guilt,
and they're
control and
right.
obedience.
And the first people they arrest are the comedians. I mean, because
is that true?
I'm saying people are making fun of them. If you write a newspaper column and making fun of the
best news in the United States now is Jon Stewart and Bill Maher. It seems like
and it makes you see how bad the news is. That the news is not doing exactly what they're doing, which is wait a second. Did you say 3 weeks ago something else? Mm-hmm. It's a small thing. A news. You figure NBC can afford to look at those tapes,
right? Yeah.
You don't only that or Jon Stewart,
right?
Or whatever. So joy. I think that becomes an important thing. And the Hasidic movement, when it came into its beginnings in the middle of the 18th century, and that inspires a lot of what we do at TVZ, what inspired Reb Zalman and Reb Shlomo, was that the Baal Shem Tov, the master of the good name, the so-called originator of Chassidism, he basically got that point. He said, look, if you can't do it with joy, something's not right.
And that was threatening to the rabbis of the time,
because they were afraid he was going to take all these pearls and throw them in front of the swine, which is popular lyricism.
So we just have a few more minutes for this first of hopefully several interviews or connections. But could you talk about Kabbalah? Because TBZ, we talk about we teach Kabbalah, but there are people who are marketing heavily Kabbalah.
We are not a Kabbalistically oriented congregation. We, however, are informed by the fact that there is a mystical tradition. Now, that tradition is one of 3 different traditions. We try to be, as you know very much because you studied with us for so long, we believe you have to have all the 4 things going at the same time, which is basically understand what you're saying, which is sort of basically helpful. What does the text actually say? Yeah. Second, okay, now that the text says that, what could it also say? And third, what would I like it to say? How do I use my sacred text to further an ideal or an idea or teaching or a way of life, etc.? And then, of course, there are those subterranean esoteric things, and they're helpful, but they're not the end all and be all. However, to be a Kabbalist, and this is what we always talk about, and I know my teachers you've spoken to as well, is to be someone who receives. That's all it means. There's no, the word mystic isn't in there. Someone who has agreed to be a receiver, and by being a receiver will be a transmitter. That's all it means. It means the tradition. Of course, for the mystic, the tradition was their only tradition, was their tradition, basically. So Kabbalah has gotten to have become, of course, associated with so many different popular singers and performers and secret stuff, and give you this magic handshake, the water, and eternal life, and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, you don't need to know Torah or study Torah, and you don't need to be Jewish.
Well, that was
it's a magic.
And that's been the most popularization of. Not to say that we didn't have Christians who were interested in Kabbalah. We had many in the medieval period, Christian Kabbalists, etc. Many of them, by the way, would do far more.
Interesting.
You know what I mean? They knew the Torah. They knew many of them knew rabbinic sources as well. But they just felt that this was a good way for them to understand how they can fit the Christology into a new way by seeing Christ as that primordial man rather than Adam. That's why they were very interested in it. But whatever, Kabbalah, the idea that there is that there's something deeper, something beyond what we can see, that there are emotions and there are psychological interactions that are part of our way of seeing the world, is I think what Kabbalah's contribution was. That there is a psychology even in religion. And their understanding of Torah as being more than just a historical document, but a place where various eternal principles can play out, is their great contribution. So, a classic example we talk about all the time is that Shirley raises her hand. No.
5 minutes.
5 minutes. So you will edit that out, I'm sure.
Nah.
Maybe not. It's very easy.
I forgot to tell you.
He's not Cecil B. DeMille, I can see you.
No, this is meant to be an informal chat, really.
Right. So we often talk about this, but it's something that perhaps is of interest, is that once you dehistoricize the Torah and text, and you begin to see them as eternal principles, it can be intimidating. And that's the scary part of it. On the one hand, it's refreshing as heck. It's saying, wow, these are only stories, and we know they're stories, but what is the moral of the story? Okay, I got the story, but so what's it about? Does it really matter that Moses existed, or is it important that Moses is there as a representing, if you will, this idea of endurance, of taking the word and keeping it holy? And does it matter that Abraham existed, or is it important that Abraham represents love, loving kindness? So, on the one hand, that's refreshing and liberating, and then you would say, wow, these don't have to be understood, literally, like some fundamentalists would. On the other hand, you have to be careful because not everybody has the capacity to deal with abstractions. And that was one of the reasons you had to be 40 years old and very learned and marry, because the imagery of the Kabbalah would be erotic, or would be talking about the realities of sexual relationships that are so on the one hand it's very liberating, and the other hand you have to be a little careful about it, and how it's taught and where it's taught, and etc. So that back and forth of the hidden and the revealed is basically, that's the tension in which Kabbalah lives, but it's also the tension in which we live, between the hidden and the revealed.
But would it be accurate from your point of view to say that anyone who says I'm the world's foremost Kabbalist?
No one. Look, it's like saying I'm the most modest guy in the world.
It's right. It's the opposite, right?
I mean, our saints. The famous story of the 36 hidden saints is that they're hidden.
Yeah. Right.
If you knew what they were, they wouldn't be hidden.
So if somebody says, I know more about Kabbalah than anyone else, but there are people who I think are like cult leaders who are saying, I have the magic wand, and you got to do what I tell you, otherwise bad things will happen.
Right. That is very foreign to our traditional stuff. I'm not saying there weren't people who didn't agree and stuff. Of course, we have people that agree. Sometimes the nice thing about our tradition is a 14th century person can disagree with an 11th century person and feel as if they're still in. Because
and a 21st century person can disagree with some of our.
That's what a living tradition is.
Right.
Is that, we encounter each other on the page, and we talk. But look, there were egos. I'm sure there were stuff like that. However, I cannot point to any one Kabbalist who would say, I've got it all, and all you guys are shysters, and I'm the only guy who's got the right one. That didn't happen because they first of all.
By this water, it's molecularly changed because I meditated.
Right. However, you would find that this is where I think Hasidism was a tremendous antidote. There were people who did begin, based upon I think things that they found from their environment, tremendously difficult ascetic practices, which the Baal Shem Tov said was really diverting you from where you had to go, because you got so obsessed with
because you should be involved with your family,
and you got so obsessed with the asceticism, the fasting and the self-flagellation and stuff like that. We had that too.
I didn't know we did self-flagellation.
And it was influenced by our Christian environments. I mean, the Jews didn't live hermetically sealed; they lived around, and I think the Baal Shem Tov too was influenced by some of the shamans that he were in the Carpathian Mountains. But his idea was, you really don't have to suffer in order to reach a higher level of consciousness. You can just do it with joy as well. So that was considered to be a revolutionary kind of remark to make, and it became rather, as you said, some people felt threatened by it. But in the long run, it sort of won out. What happened, and where we're going to end, I think, now, is what happened is that mystical traditions and Hasidic traditions ultimately became reactionary to modernity and wound up becoming part of the Orthodox establishment. They could not retain that vigor of the founding fathers, like I think we have perhaps not in our country necessarily retained the vigor of our founding fathers, even though they were quite a group of people,
right?
But
want to protect us from religion
and from ourselves. But so I'm saying this is the challenge. The challenge of any religious tradition is how do you avoid feeling that the only way to keep it going is by making it museum-like, preserving it rather than advancing it.
Right.
And I think that's really the way we are. Are we trying to put ourselves in amber?
Right.
Or we're saying, no, I want you to fly and grow and change and that's the way it
Right.
will make it more effective for you in your life.
Right. Well, we can go on and on. I just want to touch on a few things
Sure,
as we
please.
wrap up. Just
Please.
the teaching that I've learned about being in the now
Right.
and not just dwelling too much in the past or too much of the
Being
future,
concerned with the future.
but just really being connected and connected to community and sharing life cycle events and supporting one another. And the social justice and helping others is a high form of spiritual practice.
Absolutely.
Even-
All part of one piece. All of one piece.
My perception of our community too, there's a lot of people who say, I don't believe in God, but I believe in our practice and this
Right.
tradition.
Well, the idea of belief is a whole question we could talk about. But I'm saying in general, I think that to be...
There's the notion of prayer and meditation and
social
connecting to
justice,
the God within
and
us
social
is
justice
valid.
is part of it. It's part of it too. I mean, social justice. Meaning, the idea is balance. And you know, you've studied this for many years. There's no spiritual tradition that's really an authentic spiritual tradition that says, I want you to live an imbalanced life. Right? That's the whole point. I mean, when Buddha finds, right, it's the middle way. Maimonides, it's the golden way. Aristotle, wait a second, maybe we shouldn't go to extremes. Maybe the way to live one's life is not to be too close to the ice so we get frozen and too close to the fire so we get burned. And learning how to live that is really what we want to do. And it's not simple. If it was simple, everybody would do it.
Right.
But it's something to aim for, is to teach people that they can have internal balance, and hopefully that internal balance gives them balance in the world. And guess what? Maybe the world will be a better place.
Yeah, and I'm remembering, was it Hillel who was asked, what can you sum up?
Well, he was asked, he felt it was a very flippant question, but he said, okay, don't do to others what you wouldn't want them to do to you. The rest is commentary, and here comes the big words everybody forgets, go study.
Go study.
He wasn't saying, stay with those
Right.
25 words or less, there's a lot more, but let me give you the basic, what we're trying to get to.
But the essence of
The
compassion.
essence, exactly.
Don't do to others what you don't want them to.
And he took the easy way of saying it. He could have said it the other way too, which is the positive way. Love your neighbor as yourself.
Yeah.
This is easier. This is saying, okay, I know what hurts me, so I won't do it to you.
That's interesting.
And that's empathic. And the creation, as you know, is in all of your work, is when people lose that capacity to be empathic. That's really the danger point.
It's huge. Thank you.
My pleasure.
So much for everything.
We did it.
Thanks. Don't get up yet.
Thanks to our entire crew, all of you. Hey, Bill, Ed, Charlie, that's great. And the catering table, terrific. Thanks to all of you out there.
Okay.